I've had a bit of a backlog with news recently. That is to say, the things I'm going to be talking about in the next few videos may seem a couple of days out of the news, but I think they're still relevant. Um, for this one, I want to talk about the findings of the Salisbury case. Actually, there's different names that we can attach to what happened in the city of Salisbury in summer 2018. The Salisbury case, the Skripal case, the Salisbury poisoning, the Skripal affair. It could go by various names. For the purpose of this video, I'll refer to it as the Salisbury case. Salisbury is not a very big city, perhaps I think about 50,000 people, and it found itself at the forefront of the new Cold War. I've said before, I believe that we are in a new Cold War. I've no doubt about that. And these findings are not really surprising, but they're worth reading out. Now, before I get into this, I'm just going to directly address the cynics, that is, those people who dispute that Russia had anything to do with this. The Kremlin's lies have been exposed time and time and time again. But leaving that aside, one of the main arguments that they use is the fact that the Porton Down military facility is very near Salisbury. It's in Wiltshire. And they say, oh, that seems like a coincidence, i.e. the British could easily just have concocted something in order to frame Russia. My question with that, well, there's 2 points I'd like to make to that claim. Firstly, yes, it is true that Porton Down is nearby, but given a head-to-head between the United Kingdom and Russia, Russia is probably a more powerful country, at least it was at that time. I'm not so sure about now. Russia has more nuclear warheads. It's a much bigger country. It doesn't have a bigger economy. The UK has a bigger economy, but I wouldn't fancy a one-on-one with Russia. I love the Putin regime, but I'm realistic. I don't know if we could win on a one-to-one with Russia. So the obvious question there is, why would the British side make something up? It doesn't make sense. Why would they falsely accuse Russia, thus provoking tensions, thus provoking escalation? It just doesn't make sense. It would be like poking a bear. That doesn't make sense. Secondly, this doesn't take into account other incidents that we've had with Russia that are not necessarily near military facilities. For example, the Litvinenko poisoning in 2006, and also the suspicions around the death of Boris Berezovsky and others. The Salisbury case is probably the most high profile, but the Litvinenko case in 2006, he died in a London hospital. No military facility near there, at least not any that produces chemical warfare. So, I think it's far too easy for the Putin apologists to say, oh, look, it's near a military facility, so it must be an inside job. If it was very sloppy, put it that way. I think it's far more plausible that this ruling, and by the way, it's an independent inquiry, it's far more plausible that that is indeed the case. So I'm just going to read out this report from the Daily Mirror. They were covering on this the other day. It's quite poignant headline. Don's blood is on his hands. That's referring to the British woman Dawn Sturgis, who was a fatal victim of this. The Skripals both survived, as did the policeman who got seriously ill, but this was a British citizen who died at the hands of Russian chemical warfare on the streets of Britain. That's really what this amounts to. Just going to read out some of the report. I'm not going to read out everything as usual because it's quite, rightly so, it's quite extensive. This report's by Patrick Hill and it's from the 5th of December. A mum of 3 killed in the Salisbury poisoning outrage was the innocent victim of a Russian attempt to assassinate a double agent on UK soil, an inquiry found. Dawn Sturgis, 44, died 3 weeks after spraying herself with a discarded bottle of the Novichok, thinking it was perfume. She was given the Nina Ricci bottle by her partner Charlie Rowley, who had found it in the charity bin shortly after the attempted assassination of a former Russian spy, Sergei Skripal, and his daughter Julia in Salisbury, Wiltshire. He also fell ill but survived, as did Detective Sergeant Nick Bailey, Mr. Skripal and his daughter Yulia, who were poisoned when the deadly nerve agent was left on the knob of their front door in March 2018. I said summer 2018 was actually a bit earlier. Chairman Lord Hughes of Ombersley said evidence that the attempted assassination by GRU agents, including two known as Alexander Petrov and Ruslan Boshirov, was a Russian state attack, was overwhelming. He said it constituted a public demonstration of Russian state power for both international and domestic impact, and amounted to a public statement that Russia will act decisively in what regards its own interests. And he added, I have concluded the operation to assassinate Sergei Skripal must have been authorized at the highest level by President Putin. The conduct of Petrov and Boshirov and those who offered the mission up to and including I have found President Putin was astonishingly reckless. They, and only they, bear the moral responsibility for Don's death. Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood said Don Sturgis was an innocent victim of a reckless and callous act. Of course the Kremlin denies it, but they would, wouldn't they? You know, is anyone seriously going to think Putin's regime is going to come clean? Now, this is some of the key findings of this inquiry. Putin is morally responsible for Don Sturgis' death. He authorised the operation to assassinate Sergei Skripal. Evidence was overwhelming that the bid to kill him was a state attack, as opposed to rogue agents. Russian agents left Novichok on the Skripal's door handle, and 999 staff could have been poisoned. That's putting more people's lives at risk. They abandoned the remaining Novichok where it might cause uncontrolled collateral death, i.e. in a public bin. The Novichok in the perfume bottle was made in Russia, and the agents brought it with them to Salisbury. Russian TV claims that the agents were in Salisbury to see its famous cathedral spire were ludicrous, i.e. which is tourists. Russian TV, Britain was not to blame for not preventing the attack on Mr. Skripal. What the security services have said related to that is, other than absolutely hiding him completely, they couldn't have fully prevented this. Skripal refused to change his name and rejected CCTV at home to avoid his house becoming conspicuous. Doctors couldn't have saved Don. It's worth a little bit of background on the Skripals. Mr. Skripal had defected to the UK in 2010 as part of a prisoner swap. He'd previously been imprisoned in Russia for providing information to MI6. So essentially he was a double agent but working for Britain. That's why he was targeted. One thing I think that further cements the Kremlin's guilt in this is the fact that, especially under Putin, the Kremlin never forgives double agents, never. So in 2010, I've no doubt that the Kremlin hawks are thinking, okay, this guy's being released now, but we'll get revenge on him later. 2010, 2018, I'll say 8 years. You know, they're subtle enough to do it gradually. I think that's very, very plausible. The Kremlin never forgives what they see as traitors, so I don't think there's any mystery at all with that. I think it's pretty obvious. I'm just going to read out a little bit more. There's also something that the Daily Mail is covering regarding a confrontation between a Ukrainian journalist and a woman thought to be Putin's daughter. That's worth reading a little bit. But just a little bit on this. This report's by Dave Burke. Keir Starmer called for vigilance in the wake of the Don Sturgis report as sweeping sanctions against Russia were announced. The government named 11 Kremlin operatives and announced that the GRU, Russia's military intelligence agency, is sanctioned in its entirety. That's another agency from the FSB. Mr. Starmer said the UK will always stand up to Putin's brutal regime and call out his murderous machine for what it is. Russian Ambassador Andrei Kilin was summoned to the Foreign Office. Foreign Secretary Yvette Cooper said the life of a British citizen was lost and others were put dangerously at risk on British soil as a direct result of deliberate heinous decisions by President Putin and the GRU. She continued, Putin and his GRU agents are an active threat to Britain's citizens, our security and our prosperity. We will not tolerate this brazen and despicable aggression on British soil. That is why we are exposing and sanctioning those carrying out malign acts from Moscow and ramping up efforts to crush hostile Russian activity. The report into the Salisbury poisonings comes after Russian spy ship the Yantar was spotted in British waters last month, speaking to troops at RAF Lossiemouth and Moray. Scotland. Mr. Starmer said Dawn's needless death was a tragedy and will forever be a reminder of Russia's reckless aggression. Security Minister Dan Jarvis told MPs Dawn Sturgis was the victim of an utterly reckless and dangerous act, a chemical weapons attack perpetrated by Russia on British soil. Now, this was in a public area. There was a park bench, I understand, a public area. One British citizen died, a police officer became sick, the Skripals were sick. This could have really endangered other people as well. We could have been talking about multiple deaths. Now, some might say the Kremlin didn't deliberately seek to kill a British citizen, but I loathe that term collateral damage, I don't like saying it. But the fact that they were so reckless did endanger British lives. I recall an incident where some sick jokers put up a Russian flag on Salisbury Spire sometime after the attack. Absolutely disgusting. I don't think they would have been Russian nationals, actually. I think that's more likely to have been the useful idiots in our midst. The traitors in our midst, I will say it. And, not long ago, I was at the Spar. It was, about a year ago now. And I actually saw this guy driving past, and he actually had a Russian flag on his window. Now, there was no football event going on at the time. There was no sporting event that I can think of. And I just looked at this with disgust, because there's no ostensible reason for doing that in the UK. Like I say, this wasn't for some sort of sporting event. This was apparently someone just wanting to show their support to the Russian Federation at this time. I think that I've said this before, the arrest and imprisonment of Nathan Gill, the chances that he is the only spy, the only British national working for Russia, seems to be extremely unlikely. I think the reality is there's going to be more operatives in this country. And I hope that more are exposed and brought to justice. Of course, there has to be due process. All the evidence has to be presented. We don't want miscarriages of justice. But I think that if someone is working for the Russian Federation, for example, if they go to Ukraine to fight for Russia, or indeed to go to Russia to fight for Russia, as far as I'm concerned, they should be stripped of their British passport. If they're going to work for the enemy, if they do come back to the UK, I think they should absolutely be hauled before MI5 and thoroughly investigated. If they've already been there, what investigation is needed? I think George Galloway should be questioned for his recent trip to Russia. I do not trust George Galloway. What the hell was he doing there? Frankly, I think any British national who goes to Russia at this time, if anyone who goes there as a tourist, firstly, it's about the last place I would want to be a tourist. But if they really, really are legitimately just a tourist, then they'd have to really provide evidence to that end, i.e. pictures of St. Basil's Cathedral or something. But even if it was an innocent intention, that's helping the Russian economy, which in itself is kind of abetting the enemy. And, I've said it before, I think we need to be very assertive with China as well. It's not quite the same situation because China hasn't invaded a country in the same way. And I would say at this exact moment, the direct threat from Russia is probably higher. But we should never be complacent about China. That's why when I saw a British national calling himself Jason, living in China, I believe is the name of his channel, he had an entire video rubbishing London. And this guy spends all of his videos, he's pretty successful. I think he has 600,000 subscribers. He, spends all his videos putting out pro-China propaganda and rubbishing the West. Someone like that, I think, should be seriously scrutinised. I'm not saying that they're a spy, but I think if you're working for a hostile foreign state, and that includes propaganda efforts, then you deserve contempt, but you also should be scrutinised. Now, just a little bit on the other thing that I mentioned. This is the Skripals, that's a famous photo of the Skripals in a pub. So they did survive the case. This is a case that the Daily Mail is reporting. That's Dawn Sturgis, the woman who died, British citizen. And this young woman is said to be Putin's illegitimate daughter, or secret daughter. I'll just read out a little bit of this report. The report's by Will Stewart and Olivia Al-Hussein, and it just exemplifies the tensions between Russia and Ukraine. Vladimir Putin's alleged secret daughter has apologised for his brutal war in Ukraine after she was confronted in Paris. Luisa Rosova, 22, was traced by a Ukrainian journalist whose brother was recently killed in a Russian missile attack. Rosova, real name Elisaveta Krivonigic, Krivono, that's G-I-K-H, is rumoured to have been born during an alleged affair Putin had with cleaner turned multimillionaire Svetlana Krivonigic, now a 50-year-old banker and strip club owner. Make of that what you will. The exchange was with bereaved TSN journalist Dmitry Svatnenko, whose brother Volodymyr was killed in a missile strike in November, demanding that she talk to the Russian ruler to plead with him to stop the bloodshed. Pressed on whether she supported the war, Rosova said, "I'm really sorry that this is happening. Unfortunately, I'm not responsible for the situation. I'm glad you had the courage to come up to me and to talk, but unfortunately..." In the uncomfortable interview, Svetnenko said, 3 weeks ago your father killed my brother. He asks how she can live in Europe portrayed as hateful and cursed by Putin and his propaganda machine. The reporter demanded, "Say something, do you support his policies?" Wearing a mask partially shielding her face, Rosova replied, "I did not give you permission to film me." The reporter told her, "Well, you know Kyiv is currently without power and there's an air raid alert right now. We didn't give our permission for this either. How do you feel about your father's policies? Do you support him?" "Do you support him?" she replied. "What does this have to do with me?" He reminded her, "Well, he's your father. At the very least, you could call him right now and say, 'Dad, stop shelling Kyiv.'" Rosova lives in Paris and works for 2 art galleries. She uses the family names Rosova or Rodnova, the surname of a close Putin friend in France. There is evidence she has expressed fears about the consequences of her making an overt public stand against Putin. While it is alleged that Rosova is his daughter and that her mother became wealthy, worth around £75 million, I don't like that expression, worth around it. Anyway, after her relationship with the Russian ruler, it is unclear how much contact she had with Putin as she grew up. She does not seem to have a close resemblance to him. He has neither acknowledged her nor denied he is her father, but the mainstream Russian media is banned from mentioning her. Of course they are. Putin wouldn't be the first dictator to have had dalliances with mistresses. Now, people might think that young woman isn't to blame for Putin's policies, and that's probably true. But from a human perspective, if you have someone, in front of you that you know is a likely relative of Putin, and you lost your relative to Russian aggression, it would be very hard to restrain yourself. The report doesn't say that he was physically aggressive. He didn't physically attack her. But quite frankly, I think he's got a right to ask questions. But some people would write to say, what's she doing in Paris? A lot of rich Russians living in Europe, and I include Britain in that, may say that they don't support Putin and they shouldn't be collectively tarred with the same brush. And there may be an argument for that. But there's another side to it, which is why should they benefit from, living in safety in Paris or London or other parts of Europe, especially if they have Putin ties. I'm not sure that it's enough to simply denounce Russia's invasion of Ukraine post-2022 if they were not denouncing Putin's policies before 2022. For example, Roman Abramovich, he denounced the invasion after 2022. But these people were close to Putin. Now, this young woman, there's some debate over how close she actually is. But I can understand the journalist's sentiments. I can understand that. She's living, no doubt, in wealth. She's got very cushy deals with these art galleries. Is that right? Whilst Ukrainians are struggling with basic needs. I mean, if she really does want to show that she's different, she's separate from her father, she could be doing something, for example, raising money for Ukrainian charities, something. She doesn't even need to do it in the public eye if she's worried about her own safety, which, given what happened in Salisbury, is not totally inconceivable. There may be something in that. As far as I'm concerned, if she's living in the West, she needs to do a bit more than just say this when she's confronted. She needs to actively show that she is, distant from her father. She needs to be donating to Ukrainian charities. She could even renounce her Russian citizenship. If she really didn't want to be associated with Putin, she could get French citizenship. She could do something. more than just saying, oh, it's awful what's happening. Now, having said that, there are Russians who take very real risks, both within Russia and outside Russia, and I do have a lot of respect for them. But one of the problems of war, any war, is it creates generational bitterness. Now, I've said before, it's not for me to tell Ukrainians how to feel, and I never would. But I don't personally agree with vilifying all Russians in the sense that there are Russians who have taken risks to stand up to the regime. Having said that, polling has showed that a very high percentage of Russians do support Putin. So if Russian opposition figures say that most Russians are against him, that isn't true. It doesn't correspond with the facts. It may be that in a dictatorship it's difficult to ascertain true sentiments, and it may be that a lot of Russians publicly say they support Putin because they have no choice. There's also a class thing going on, and this is maybe worth its own video, so I'll wrap up with this. But Russia's middle class hasn't been overtly affected by the war so far, even economically. But the working class, those on the margins, poor families living in Siberia or other remote republics, it's their sons who are being killed in their thousands on the front lines of Ukraine. Those people may well start feeling resentment. In the 1980s, the Soviet-Afghan War was sometimes called Russia's Vietnam. 15,000 Russians died in that war. The Russian casualties in Ukraine are significantly higher. We'll probably never know the true toll, but it could be up to 1 million casualties, including the wounded. So with such a high toll, there's bound to be Russians getting angry with Putin, wondering why their husbands, their sons, their brothers have been killed. And it's a sad thing. In many cases, these are poor young men who have limited education, who are used as basically human shields by the Russian Federation. Putin does not give a damn about them. This is a regime that is totally devoid of any human emotions, devoid of any human compassion. It's absolutely brutal, cold. It's like the worst sort of dystopian ideas of what the Soviet Union was, but I think possibly even worse, because I think Putin as a dictator is far worse than Khrushchev or Brezhnev or even Andropov. And Yuri Andropov was a hardline KGB figure. I think Putin is worse than any of them. I think Putin's the most brutal Russian tyrant, Soviet tyrant in the past sense, since Stalin. I'm just saying that, but Stalin was a Georgian. But yeah. And I do believe Putin is the biggest threat to this continent since World War II. But that is the finding of Salisbury. Shame on all those who continue to support Russia, I should say. Shame on them. Shame on them, shame on them, shame on them. Reform, this isn't going to end with Nathan Gill. I would not at all be surprised if further ties to Russia are exposed with reform. Like I say, their candidate last year in Salisbury of all places, Julian Mallon, was praising Putin. That is a callous insult to the city that was targeted by the Russian Federation. He lost, thankfully, but there's others. George Galloway. I think Galloway needs to be, scrutinised. Why was he recently in Russia? He was held up at Gatwick Airport for a few hours. I want to know why he was in Russia. Because Galloway, as far as I'm concerned, is a snake. A bit like Jeremy Corbyn, he has never supported this country when it comes to foreign aggression. So I go with what that inquiry has ruled. Putin has blood on his hands. So anyone who wants to talk about, this is all about Ukraine, this predates 2022. 2018 we're talking about. I remember at the time the May government, to her credit, she took swift action, expelled a lot of Russian diplomats. It was the biggest expulsion, I understand, since the last Cold War. And maybe Starmer will do likewise. I know goes without saying, with very frosty relations with Moscow. We're too close to Beijing. I'm not happy with Starmer's attitude to that. He seems to think we can balance diplomacy and kind of pandering to China with also condemning their interference. No, I think he has to be a lot more robust. China may not present the same threat as Russia in quite the same way. I don't think China's going to, for example, bring chemical warfare onto British streets, but they have shown kind of soft power aggression. The three governments that we absolutely cannot trust, that is Moscow, Beijing and Tehran. But quite frankly, the way Trump is behaving these days, the things he's coming out with, we can't entirely trust Washington these days either.